A mile off the southeast coast of Cape Cod, the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge sits in splendid isolation from the busy mainland. These uninhabited barrier islands host one of the most important migratory bird sanctuaries on the East Coast. They are also home to one of the largest gray seal colonies in the Northwest Atlantic. But while the wildlife quietly goes about its business on the islands, nature is wreaking havoc just across the channel at the mainland headquarters of the refuge. The Morris Island headquarters of the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge is under siege. In just 2 years, erosion has torn more than 100 feet from the bluff, destroying hundreds of trees, forcing the demolition of buildings, cut off public beach access, and set off a scramble to find a new location to house the refuge's administrative offices and visitor center. While Cape Cod is no stranger to erosion, something else is going on here and in other places around the Cape. More severe storms, rising tides, and warming waters are contributing to what can only be called a crisis on the coast of Cape Cod. Eddie Horowitz, president of the volunteer Friends of Monomoy, has witnessed nature's rampage at the refuge up close and personal.
What's happened here?
Everything's changed. It's all about erosion. People are really shocked when they come here, and the reason is they can't believe what's happened. And I tell them that the erosion is all the way up and down the Cape, but having this spot right here is where it's the worst.
While the Friends try to help the public understand the problem with advancing erosion, Refuge Manager Rick Nye has the unenviable task of overseeing the daily operations of the refuge and its dwindling assets on Morris Island.
Right here we had a forest of about 200 trees that had a boardwalk running through the middle of it. And that boardwalk led to a staircase that went down to the beach. The beach was about 100 feet deep. Also, there was a beach in front of the revetment, which allowed visitors to walk around the island. Then right here, we had a dorm that allowed us to house up to 12 interns. It was a 100-year-old dorm that used to belong to the Coast Guard. And then over here, behind us, was where the National Weather Service had their balloon launch station. Today, about a third of that building will be hanging over the edge of the bluff.
According to climate scientists, ice sheets are melting at an unprecedented rate. The globe's temperature has increased by 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1850, and ocean waters are warming faster, most of which can be attributed to human activity. These effects of climate change are being felt throughout Cape Cod, whether it's warmer water temperatures contributing to algae blooms and eelgrass die-offs, or stronger, more frequent storms pounding the coast and regular flooding from sea level rise. Rich Delaney of the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown has been tracking climate change and its effects on the Cape, which go far beyond erosion.
Cape is unique in a couple of ways. One is the waters right off our coast are warming faster than any place in the world, so that's intensifying a lot of the impacts that we know about, sea level rise and so forth. So I think erosion and water-related impacts. For example, we live on a sole source aquifer. We know it's delicate. With climate change, we'll have extended droughts and extended wet periods that are more intense, and those impacts are going to be negative on our water supply. So the interconnection among all of those issues, water, warming temperatures, more climate intense storms, will be the biggest threat.
Climate change is impacting more than just the physical geography of Cape Cod. The commercial fishing industry and the Cape's tourist-based economy are also feeling the effects of the changes that scientists attribute to man's influence on the climate. Bill Amaru has fished off Cape Cod for over 50 years and seen plenty of changes.
Given the issues of warming in our environment, the ocean waters are affected immensely. A change of a few degrees has an enormous impact on the amount of fish that you might have in a place at a given time of year, and that is what we see here.
The rising water temperatures are also causing the endangered North Atlantic right whale to spend more time in Cape Cod Bay. That may not be good for the huge cetaceans, as it leaves them more vulnerable to a dangerous ship strikes, says Michael Moore, a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, who's been studying right whales for over 25 years.
Right now, it seems as though the right whales are finding food, good food, in Cape Cod Bay from January through early May, mostly in April and March and April. However, we don't really understand how the future looks for that, or whether the right whales are eating in the gutter and that's all that's left, or whether it really is a bountiful table for them and that's where they want to be.
Climate change not only threatens the region's fish and large fauna, the tiny creatures upon which the food chain depends are at risk as well. Brian Harrington, emeritus biologist with the Manomet Center, has been studying migratory birds on Cape Cod for more than half a century. He's observed the impact climate change has had on their food source.
I really think that in terms of science, a high priority for this whole coastal system here is to have a better understanding of what climate change is doing to the critters that are living in the bays and in the mud and in the sand. That's at the root of everything.
Morris Island lies at the convergence of the Atlantic Ocean and Nantucket Sound. Along with the headquarters for the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, Morris Island is home to an exclusive community of multi-million-dollar homes, many of which are now threatened by climate change-fueled erosion. For much of its history, Morris Island was a wilderness. Historic maps and navigation charts show that the island was sometimes attached to the mainland and sometimes cut off by navigable waterways. Its attachment to Monomoy Island comes and goes with Chatham's notorious shifting sands. When connected to the mainland, it provided access to Monomoy, a popular waterfowl and shorebird hunting area in the 19th and early 20th century. When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service established the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge on the remote Monomoy Island in 1944, it included as its headquarters a 4-acre plot of land on Morris Island containing a former Coast Guard building. In the early 1970s, the National Weather Service established a radar and later a weather balloon launching station on the headquarters property. The erosion destroying the refuge headquarters is also a problem elsewhere on Morris Island. It's undermining 25-year-old revetments to the west, endangering 4 waterfront homes with a collective value of more than $50 million. Most at risk is the refuge's closest neighbor, Neil Shalom.
I actually noticed one day that it kind of happened at once. So it was a little bit of erosion, and I figured who knows what will happen after the breakthrough. But one day I came and the stairs had fallen into the ocean, and there was just one big day or one big week that there was a lot. It all kind of loosened up and fell into the ocean, and all of a sudden it became a crisis.
Neil Shalom installed an elaborate and expensive structure to try to hold back the encroaching erosion, which Coastal Marine Construction Project Manager Gareth King called the worst he's ever seen.
So here we're installing 60-foot sheets to minimize the erosion. It's going to be done in 2 stages. Stage 1, we're going to install the sheets. Stage 2, we're going to install tie-back anchors, which will go a minimum of 22 feet into the existing ground underneath the house that we're trying to protect. It's such a tight site with the land continuously eroding and moving. It's a challenging job.
The erosion happening on Morris Island is not unexpected, but it is unusual. Chatham's east coast has undergone periodic bouts of coastal erosion for centuries. Dr. Mark Borelli, a coastal geologist with the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, says Chatham's geography makes it especially vulnerable to erosion.
Chatham is incredibly dynamic. You have the combination of an entirely natural beach, open ocean, and it's very, very frequent. A lot of inlet formation, a lot of storms, so it's very dynamic. Sea level absolutely plays a vital role in that erosion deposition cycle, and it's changing everything. So as sea levels increase, a lot of things are going to change.
Chatham's 140-year barrier beach cycle was first described by Dr. Graham Geiss, who recreated the pattern over centuries using historical maps. The most recent cycle began with an inlet that formed in 1987. But climate change is making this barrier beach cycle less predictable. Chatham Coastal Resources Director Ted Keon has had a front row seat as the process plays out.
The barrier beach cycle, is a documented cycle that has its own migration, components to it that are understood. Sea level rise, climate change is absolutely impacting that. Presumably it's speeding that process up, making some of these, changes probably more rapid than they would have occurred.
On April 1st, 2017, a new inlet formed in North Beach across the harbor from Morris Island. The Fool's Cut, as it was known, opened up the island's shoreline to direct attack by the Atlantic Ocean.
It's because of the 2017 break that this erosion is occurring right now. And it's a very unusual situation. The tidal range in the Atlantic Ocean is different than the tidal range in Nantucket Sound. And that's why the waves and the water moving through here are almost unidirectional. It's almost like a river as opposed to a bidirectional tidal flow that you would normally get. So it's contributed to that erosion even more.
The currents going past Morris Island are so fast that they carved out a 40-foot deep channel west of the refuge headquarters, undermining and destroying a seawall protecting a $20 million home. A few years after the Fool's Cut, the coastal bank at the Monomoy Refuge headquarters began to show signs of severe erosion. Staff began moving boardwalks away from the eroding cliff in 2020. Stairs to the beach were chainsawed apart and removed in 2021. A few months later, the National Weather Service sent up its last weather balloon, and its station was demolished. In an attempt to protect the top of the bank, dozens of trees were removed in early 2022. That fall, the dorm and garage, the former Coast Guard building that had stood on the site for 100 years, was demolished to prevent it from tumbling down the eroding cliff. As the sea continues to eat away at the bluff, the visitor center and administration building will be next, forcing the agency to scramble to find new quarters.
We've looked at several locations that might work for us, but as you can imagine on Cape Cod, it's very difficult to find something that works for us. Also, the government procurement process is currently being outpaced by the rate of erosion, which makes this a very complicated situation.
While refuge officials search for a new headquarters, neighbors fight to save their homes from the sea's assault, even as the federal government continues to let nature take its course.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hasn't done anything to protect the bluff because our primary missions and priority is the conservation of plants and animals out on the Monomoy Islands. We have 8,000 acres out there versus the 2 acres up here. And I have to also think about the long-term maintenance and upkeep costs of a structure like that.
That decision left the Shalom family to fight nature on its own.
When I approached them with this erosion, there was just no one home. We have a very sympathetic manager at Wildlife Preserve, but it's not his decision. It has to go up the chain to the government. And they've just been unwilling to do anything to save their property.
For scientists, the situation is far more complex.
If the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had armored this, they would have accelerated erosion on either side of that armoring, so that would have negatively impacted their neighbors and the system. Just very similar to what's going on behind us with the structure there. So had they done that, they might have prevented some of the erosion in this area, but they would have caused other problems. And in the future, they would have caused themselves more problems.
Morris Island isn't the only place on Cape Cod endangered by climate change. Other erosion and flooding hotspots include Nauset Beach in Orleans, Ballston Beach in Truro, Provincetown, Sandwich, and Falmouth.
The way Cape Cod will evolve with sea level rise will depend on where you are in Cape Cod. If you're on the outer beach in the Cape Cod National Seashore, things are going to happen pretty regularly and pretty predictably. When you start to introduce what we do to the coast in terms of dredging or structures or beach replenishment and things like that, that's the wild card. So things can change really rapidly because of structures, because of human interaction.
The region's flora and fauna are also reacting to the increase in water temperatures and sea level and the changing weather patterns. Although overfishing is a significant factor, warming waters are also contributing to the virtual disappearance from Cape waters of signature fish species like haddock and cod.
In the last decade, the warming waters, without a question of a doubt, has had a major impact on the shifts of fish from one place to another. We've had more fish from the south, and our fish, they have to be moving further to colder waters. I'm a believer that human impacts have a lot to do with what's going on in our environment. But I also believe that the environment is capable of adjusting to whatever changes take place. This has been going on for hundreds of millions of years.
Both Brian Harrington and Michael Moore see a link between climate change and the tiny invertebrates that are the primary food source for both migrating shorebirds and the endangered right whale.
The thing that I'm most concerned about with respect to climate change is what it's doing to the invertebrate animal communities. That's at the bottom of the food chain for all of our fish that are using the bay here, that are using Nantucket Sound. It's the bottom of the food chain for all the shorebirds. It's the bottom of the food chain for all the commercial fisheries. I frankly feel that that's an area where we need a much better understanding than what we have today.
Every living thing is dependent upon finding its optimum temperature, optimum salinity for ocean animals, currents, tides, nutrients, daylight length, all of those things play into the optimum for growth and reproduction and foraging if you're a predator. So climate change will have direct impacts on all of those different things.
Cape Codders are nothing if not resilient. In the past, houses were picked up and moved when threatened by the sea. Chatham's twin lighthouses were abandoned to eventually succumb to erosion, and new beacons were built farther back from the bluff. In other towns, lighthouses were relocated several hundred feet back from eroded bluffs, such as Highland Light in Truro and the 225-year-old Gay Headlight on Martha's Vineyard. Retreat from today's heavily developed coast isn't always possible. In recognition of the current and future impacts of climate change, many efforts are underway throughout the Cape. Most towns have climate committees charged with coming up with plans to boost coastal resiliency. Resilient Woods Hole, a collaboration among 3 major science institutions and local stakeholders, is planning adaptation, mitigation, and flood-proofing strategies for that Falmouth village, and has developed a climate change walking trail to educate residents and visitors. Across the Cape, residents gather to discuss climate change and brainstorm ways to make the region more resilient. The Pleasant Bay Alliance is working on a climate adaptation action plan aimed at protecting both the man-made and natural resources of the Cape's largest estuary.
Our mission really is to help Cape Codders find ways to reduce our carbon footprint, basically reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we produce. And we do that through education, advocacy, urging people to take action in hometowns, a whole series of steps. But really, we're all in this together, and this group is trying to spread the word and create action among all of us to do our part to combat climate change.
Other members of the Cape community are also working to raise awareness of climate change. Brian McGurk, for 20 years the rector at St. Christopher's Episcopal Church in Chatham, is co-chair of the Faith Community Environmental Network and a member of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative.
We see it as a moral imperative to address this because this is our home, Earth, the only home we'll ever have, and it's incumbent upon all of us to leave a legacy of a healthy planet.
Scientists say many of the impacts of climate change will happen even if steps are taken to reduce or eliminate the carbon emissions causing most of the warming. Taking action now to avoid making things even worse in the future is an existential issue for many young people. Christy Beckley, a Monomoy High School graduate and Harvard University student, decided to take action herself by organizing the Chatham Beach Protection Fund.
Chatham Beach Protection Fund is an idea based on the premise of the town of Chatham using the revenue they receive each summer from the daily, weekly, and seasonal beach pass fees and dedicating a portion of those fees into an ongoing fund each year, a fund that's dedicated to protecting the shorelines of Chatham.
While the town of Chatham builds a war chest to fight climate change, refuge neighbor Neil Shalom continues to fight to save his family home and help neighbors whose homes are also threatened by rising tides and erosion.
It's very aggravating. We love the nature, we love the wildlife preserve. It's just a shame that it had to happen. I get climate change, I get rising tides, I understand that, but there's things you can do to offset it. And saving beautiful places seems like a no-brainer to me. I'm angry about it. It's not the people locally here. They're very sympathetic to what's going on. It's really the federal government, and I think that is just what it is. I mean, to get them to focus on this, I think, is a challenge. They have bigger things to focus on, and I think it's as simple as that.
While those on the front line engage in fighting nature and bureaucracies, many Cape Codders are working to change people's behavior to mitigate, if not reverse, the damage.
One of the climate deniers' arguments was that it was way too costly to address climate change. It's actually just the reverse. Climate change presents a huge opportunity for a blue-green economy for us with the ocean, because there are so many opportunities to develop clean energy technologies, have them installed, transition our cars from to electric. All that presents economic opportunity, not cost.
I think that what's happened has to do with global warming. Some of my buddies that I fish with, they don't believe that. They believe that it's just the natural cycle of life, and I don't believe that. I believe the water's gotten warmer, it's getting warmer, and it's causing us a lot of problems here.
I think that my peers and I are a little frustrated at the ways that climate change has been handled in other generations, and I know that I'm frustrated.
I do think that the faith communities have a role in holding out hope and inspiration to make the changes that are going to need to be done. What we do know is scientific data isn't enough to change behaviors, and it takes a deeper dive into our own consciousness and asking ourselves deeper questions of how we can affect changes in ourselves.
The biggest physical threats to Cape Cod we know about: sea level rise, more intense storms, erosions, drought. Those are all going to be impacting us. But beyond that, I worry about the biggest threat being people in action, not willing to change the way we live our lives to be greener or be more climate friendly. That's the biggest concern, because we all have to change in order to solve the problem.
We have to have optimism, but we also have to get a whole lot more aggressive in terms of what we're doing.
People ask me a lot about what I think about climate change in the future, and I'm pretty hopeful because we're having conversations like this, right? Because there are programs like this, there are lots of dialogues and discussions about this kind of thing. So in a sense, I'm pretty hopeful. We have a lot of work in front of us. We have a lot to do, but I think I'm an optimist, and I think as long as the first thing we have to do is not make it worse. And by not armoring this bluff, they've taken a big step toward not making it worse.
Inevitably, erosion is about to claim the last building standing on the Fish and Wildlife's Morris Island property. The visitor center and headquarters is now close enough to the bluff that the agency has decided to abandon it and will soon tear it down. Trails on the other side of the island remain accessible to the public, for now.
We've accomplished a lot from our Morris Island footprint over the last 80 years. The loss of our visitor center and our management facilities, it's a heartfelt loss for the community as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But our trails remain open and give opportunities for visitors to go hiking and see habitat that's just like the habitat they see out on the wilderness areas. And our work on the island continues. We'll continue to monitor the terns and the gray seals and the horseshoe crabs and the migratory birds that come through. Our mission will carry on and our journey will move forward from wherever our new home will be.
The devastation at Morris Island provides a preview of how climate change could ultimately impact the rest of this fragile peninsula. But it's not a future set in stone. People created the climate crisis, and people can prevent the worst from happening. Be part of the solution. Support coastal resilience policies. Join your local climate action committee. Do what you can to make the changes necessary to preserve one of the most beautiful places on the planet, Cape Cod.
Cape Cod will definitely be here in 500 years. Parts of it won't be, but Cape Cod will be.